And it's very interesting how life works out sometimes. When Beata first asked me, it was probably around December, I think it was between Christmas and New Year's Eve, somewhere between that. When she first asked me to do a talk here, and I think actually already then one of the topics you wanted was about the psychology of grief. I didn't know that it would end up being so personal, because the 7th of January I lost my mom, and I had to travel to Sierra Leone. And it's been a very interesting process because, you know, as a psychologist, often you talk about things theoretically, or you talk about things and you relate to other people and their stories and their lives. And then every now and then you have to relate to things on a very personal level. And in many ways, I think it is what it is. Grief is what it is. It's about loss. And we all lose things, and we lose people, and we lose jobs, and we lose loved ones, and we lose our country. And what I would like to do, I would like to spend some time just talking about grief. But talking about, I think the best way I can do this is to just tell you a little bit of my story and relate it more generally. But in a way, the story is like this, is that we all experience loss at some point or the other in many different ways, you know. And grief is a very natural process. I actually very clearly sometimes say to people, it's like, I don't treat grief. Don't come to me if you're experiencing grief, because grief is natural. You don't treat something that's natural, you know? Grief is something we all experience at different times in our lives. But grief is something that can get rather complicated, because there's so many different ways people can experience grief. And the truth is, you know, us psychologists, we're good at making up new diagnoses and definitions to keep ourselves in work, you know. So today people talk about grief, the normal grief, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. But there's other types of grief that develop. So what I would like to do, here's the structure I want to start with, just explaining a little bit about what grief is and how it expresses itself. Use my personal experience that is very real and very current, just to help us understand what grief is, but then also generalize to other forms of grief other people have experienced, and also come in with a bit of hope, you know. And for me, actually, the transition from quite a heavy grief to hope was almost quite dramatic, you know, and there's many parallels I can draw. So let me just start by saying, yeah, like I said, grief is a natural thing. Grief is about loss. And the thing that's interesting, like grief, like many other psychological phenomena, it is very subjective. So it's a question of how strongly do I feel this grief, how great a loss I feel I've had, regardless of what everybody else thinks. Do you know what I mean? Because let's imagine someone. Occasionally, I have to do crisis. Forgive me, every now and then Danish will slip out. I have to do these crisis and debriefing talks with people, and you know, sometimes we make these jokes that as a psychologist, there's certain things you're not allowed to say. So if someone's coming there and crying and is really struggling, you're not allowed to say, "Get yourself together." Are you? You know, you're not allowed to say that. But it's the same thing, you know, sometimes I have to debrief people who've lost their jobs, and you want to almost say to them, "Hey, it's just a job." But the truth is, if they subjectively experience this as a huge loss, and you don't know what it means to them, you don't know what that job security meant. Maybe the loss of that job could have consequences for their family. They could have consequences for their future career. They might lose their home. So you don't know. And that's why I say it's always subjective. So you can't just think, but it's just, you know. So I lost my mom there the 7th of January, and it was really strange because I could see how I went through the phases. You know, they talk about, and sometimes I like to use PowerPoint. Roger decided I didn't need one today, and he's right. I'm just teasing him. We decided I didn't need it. But there's 5 stages classically we talk about grief developed by Kubler-Ross. The first is denial. And I remember that with myself. When I got a call, my mom's sick, she's in hospital. Immediately I started worrying. I think, okay, she's 82 now, and every now and then she struggles and things get difficult. But let's see how it happens. But anyway, within 2 days, I get the call from my brother. And I know what my first reaction was, and it was classic denial. I was like, oh, I knew this was going to happen. Oh, well, we'll have to be strong, etc. You know, and then we put the phone down. And then it sinks in. And I have to call him back. Hey, you know how you said mom didn't make it? What did you mean by that? There was this barrier. It was hard. And on the one hand, I was expecting it a little bit. I was scared. I thought, this doesn't sound good with everything they're describing. But on the other hand, there was this denial that went up that just said, you know how you said mom didn't make it? And I said, yeah, I knew this might happen, etc. You know, can you just spell it out for me so I'm in no doubt what you mean? You know? And so, of course, he said this to me. So the first stage people talk about is denial. And then after that often comes anger, you know, where people, they can get angry at God, they can get angry at the doctors for not saving, they can even get angry at the person who died for abandoning them or leaving them. I didn't get a lot of anger, to be honest. I was frustrated by the situation. I think the frustration is the distance. So if there's any anger, it's that feeling of helplessness. Your mom's all this way away. I can't even talk to her, you know. I feel God was kind to me this time. When I say this time, I mean, when I lost my dad, I had such guilt for such a long time because I took him for granted, and it's embarrassing to say, don't judge me too harshly. But it'd been like almost 2 months since I last spoke to him. And like that, he was gone. And I could do nothing about it. And I vowed that wouldn't happen again. So I've been quite good. And I called my mom. I used to call my mom weekly. I even have a reminder on my phone every Saturday. It still pops up, which is starting to get annoying now because I almost want to cry every time I go. I'm like, oh, I have no mom to ring anyway. I need to delete it, you know. But it's like, I thought this is not going to happen again. So in God's kindness, I feel like I actually spoke to my mom on a Wednesday, had a lovely conversation with her, and that was the last time I spoke to her. Because by the Sunday, she was dead, you know. So my frustration was more with the distance. So I didn't have the same guilt that I'd had before. But the frustration was, this distance, I can't even, I know she's lying in hospital in intensive care. I can't even see her. I can't even look at her. I can't say goodbye or anything like that. So anger can be there. Frustration can be there. And then often they say, you go a phase of bargaining where you try and negotiate with God, with life, with destiny, and it's typically where you have the what-if questions, you know. What if we'd done this? What if we'd done that? What if? And it's very funny, you know, because no matter what the situation is, you will always find a what if. The human brain is amazing. You can have all sorts of fantasies, you know. What if we'd taken her to the hospital earlier? What if on Wednesday I'd asked her, Mom, how are you doing? You know, is everything okay? You sit with all these what ifs. What if things could have been different? You know. Then they say the next phase, and these things, it never just goes stage by. It's a bit of a cycle. You go back and forth a different direction. Then they say the next stage is when you enter a phase of depression and there's an emptiness. You know, there's an emptiness, there's that sense of loss, and it can express itself in many ways. You know, one of the weird things about losing my mom is that is the way that sometimes something that just reminds you, like I said, like the calendar thing or or a book, or my picture, like my wife showed me, had a picture of my graduation with my mom and dad on either side, one day sitting on the dining table, and boom, suddenly it's just like all the energy, all the joy, everything just drains out of you as you reminded of what you've lost, Or one of the strange things that is easing up now, but used to happen, but I'd have a dream. It happened with my dad too, so I was better prepared this time. I was expecting it. But I'd have a dream, and I would be with my mom, I would be having a great time, and then suddenly I would wake up and realize it was a dream. And it was just like the whole world was turned upside down. All that joy and delight I just experienced in a dream was replaced by sadness and emptiness and loss. Because this is gone. This is never coming back. It was just a dream, If it's a nightmare, you're happy when you wake up. But if it's a lovely, pleasant dream, you're a bit disappointed when you wake up. But they say the last phase then is acceptance. And I'll never forget what someone said to me when I remember flying in and waiting for the boat in Sierra Leone. The airport is on a half island, peninsula. See, it's Danish that says half island, peninsula in English. And so you often take a boat or a ferry. But I remember sitting there, and one of my friends, actually my older brother's friend, she'd lost her dad some years before. She said, "Olu, you never get over it, but you learn to live with it." And I've never forgotten that, because it's been very helpful. Because sometimes people think, "Oh, you'll get over it, you'll move on." In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. So you learn to live with it, but you don't. But the acceptance is not, "Oh, now I'm happy, hoorah." No, it's more of I can't do anything about this anyway. I cannot change the situation anyway. So I'm going to have to find a way to live with it. So those are the classic 5 stages of grief. But of course, we know that we also talk about different types of grief, because grief can also take you in different directions. Where, for example, they talk about complicated grief. And complicated grief is when you don't go through this normal cycle in the normal way. Either you get stuck in some of these phases, or it lasts way longer than you expect it to last, or it becomes so heavy. Because the truth is, grief is something that we all are going to experience at some time. So you have to find a way to get on with your life, even while you're in grief. This is one of the times it was very interesting. I remember my surprise. When my dad died, I went to my boss and said, "I need some time off." And he's like, "Yeah, you get 1 day." I'm like, 1 day? Okay, thanks. But it's this reality is that, yeah, actually, in many ways it makes sense. You can get probably 2 days. 1 day on the day it happens where you're a little bit in shock, and then 1 day on the day of the funeral. But in a way, it makes sense that because grief is a natural part of life, losing people is a natural part of life, you can't just stop your whole world. So if you are there when actually your whole world has to stop, it might be a sign that you're not going through a normal grief process, that it's become complicated, or there's many different. I'm not an expert in grief, but there is complicated grief, there's delayed grief, and this is sometimes what I warn people about. Sometimes if people stay in the denial phase too long, and they don't start dealing with it, they just park it in one corner, they block it, then actually later on it can come. And when it comes, it will come strong, and it will come unexpected, and you can't even manage it. Because if you deal with it right from the start, it's easier to navigate and manage in many ways, But if you repress it, and try and push it down, then actually it can burst forth at times when you might not even expect. And then you find yourself lost, because, if you're crying or feeling extreme grief for something that happened 6 months ago, for example, your boss wouldn't understand. "Oh, I need time off. I'm grieving for my mom." But that was 6 months ago, So what's it called? Denying our grief, repressing it, can also lead to this delayed grief. Then there's one of the things I think is very interesting is they talk about collective grief. And this is what you experience sometimes when a whole group of people, it can be a small group or it can be a large group of people together experience something so catastrophic that they're all in grief. And this is what you experience. This is what quite a few people who come from war zones and refugees sometimes have experienced this, where a whole group of people together are in grief because they've all lost someone or something, you know. Even just losing your homeland or losing your job or all the life so many people leave behind when they become refugees, you know, and the things that they go through. There's a type of solidarity that they experience with others who've gone through the same thing, but there's a kind of collective grief that can happen. And I know one of the countries where they've done quite a bit of this research has been in like Rwanda, where you had like whole villages wiped out in one go, or you've had whole generation. I have this really close friend, and he's a former full-time soldier, and now he's still a contractor who trains soldiers. And one of his greatest concerns he shared with me the other day is that in Ukraine, an entire generation of men is being wiped out. He says it's almost like it's a deliberate strategy by Putin, just wipe out men over the age of 25, right up to 50, 60. They're just disappearing in this war. So you're leaving behind whole villages of women and children in deep grief together, and actually with no men around. And it's not going to get any better. And this is the same thing we've seen in other countries too. So it's not just Ukraine. We've seen it in many other countries where men of fighting age have to go and fight. Many of them lose their lives, and you leave behind a collective grief amongst women and children. So this is a little bit about grief. One of the things I wanted to share with you was this interesting turning around that happened for me in relating to the reality of my mom's death. It first happened actually with my aunts, but I'll go back to that. I was very fortunate that one of the first people to call me and talk to me and give me their condolences and sympathies was my mom's younger sister, who they were very close. And I'll tell you what she said in a minute, because I'll come back to that. But what happened for me, there was one day, you know, I was feeling quite heavy, you know. I know that I was in denial. The same thing happened when I lost my dad. I was in denial for a while because it doesn't feel real. Because my mom's not there every day anyway. I only ever talk to her on the phone. So it's not weird that there's gone a week and I haven't spoken to her. But when I finally get to Sierra Leone and she's not there, then it starts to get weird. Because normally when I get to Sierra Leone, one of the first places I go is to my mom's, you know, even though I often stay with my brother. Sometimes I stay with her, sometimes I stay with my brother. But then it starts to feel heavy because this is real now. Mom's not here and I can't find her. It's not just, oh, she lives there, I live here, therefore I can't talk to her. It's like, she's just not there anymore. And I remember there was one particular day where I was feeling quite heavy. And I think God in his kindness just guided me to a Bible verse that changed everything for me. And I don't exaggerate when I say change. It doesn't mean I didn't cry anymore, I didn't feel sad anymore. But it started giving me this hope. And that's what I love about the title of the talk that Bert and I agreed on, is that the fact that we got to live with the past and the reality. That would be denial otherwise, and that's no good. But we can't keep losing hope for the future. And what happened with this particular day that was exciting for me was that this Bible verse suddenly came to my mind. Let me share it with you. It's in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. It says, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. The key verse for me that I embraced, I even put it on my phone. I think I still even have it as my background on my phone. I do, so that I could see it every time I picked up this piece of technology that has invaded our lives. But every time I looked at it, it was especially this bit says, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. And this became a linchpin for me, is that, the way I am going to grieve is a different kind of grief, because I have a hope. My mom has a hope. You know, the truth is, my mom was a wonderful, very active Christian woman right to the end. Right to the end. I remember our shock when one day she called us and says, I feel good. I mean, she's 82. Like a year ago, she's like, I feel God's given me a new mission. I'm thinking to myself, Mom, your only mission is to be a pensioner and enjoy the rest of your life. But she didn't think like that. She's like, I'm going to be praying for our tribe. You know, I'm from what is called the Creole tribe, and we are descendants of slaves. You know, she says, I feel now I'm going to be praying for our tribe. We're the smallest tribe in our country, all descendants of slaves. You know, and I'm going to mobilize the Creole Descendants Union. We're going to mobilize. And you know, like, she was taking on long trips. You know, like my brother told me that, there's one day Mom came home really tired. I couldn't understand it. I was worried. I thought she was sick. But she was so tired. And she went to bed, and I didn't see her for a few hours before. And when he investigated, I went on a small trip. The lady had traveled 2-3 hours out of the capital on a mission trip at 81. I thought, wow, you know. But why I'm telling you this is my mom lived life right to the end. She served God right to the end. And as my aunts put it, right from the first 15 minutes of me getting the message that I lost my mom, this is good for her. For us, we might struggle, but she's finally found rest with her Savior. As my brother said, you know, nothing was going to stop my mom except God. She kept going right to the last minute. And what it did for me, there's a principle from psychology called reframing. The reframing is basically about, can you look at the situation in a different way? Sometimes we get stuck in one interpretation or one understanding of a situation. But if you can they call it cognitive flexibility, the ability to be flexible about the way you think about things, you know. I can say, oh no, I've lost my mom. It's so sad. And yes, that is true. But I can also say, my mom is actually with her Lord and Savior, who she spent the last 50 years of her life or so serving, loving, and what could be greater for her? It's her joy. And he gave me this kind of hope. And it changed the way I thought about it. Because I kept just thinking, she's not dead. She's alive. Alive with Christ. And that's what's important. And for me, that principle of reframing, of being willing to look at the situation. Like I said to you, I don't treat grief. And I tell people, do not treat grief. Of course, if it's one of these complicated griefs and all these things where it's gone wrong. But in the natural grief process, just let it happen. And even reframing, I say it shouldn't come too early, because it can actually be a form of denial. But it is a necessary, because like this Bible verse says, we cannot grieve in the same way as others do, because we have a hope. And I was reflecting and thinking through things. So how do we deal with grief? How do we find this place where we can find the balance between recognizing that loss is sad? Doesn't matter what loss, whether it's the loss of your mom like me, or loss of other people, or loss of your job, or loss of your lifestyle, loss of your house and land, and all these things people have left behind. loss of their home country. We don't deny it. But we find hope in the future. That in one way or the other, God is with us. And one of the things I'm always careful, God has never promised us rose-tinted, lovely lives. That actually does not exist in the Bible this side of heaven. I know there's some people who like preaching that, just trust God, everything will be fine. But you don't find it in the scriptures. What you do find is that you will not walk alone. And He will be there to give you strength, and He will be there to give you comfort. And there's like Bible verses that says, no matter what you face, He will give you the strength required. So I can't come here promising anyone anything about their grief and the things they've lost in life. I can't. But what I can turn to, often in psychology we talk about there's healthy ways of coping with problems and there's unhealthy ways of coping with problems. Unhealthy ways will be when we turn to drugs or alcohol or other things that are just temporary solutions to dull the pain, but they don't last. But if we try and take a more biblical and more Christian perspective, what I've seen work for me and others, in fact, we can summarize in a really nice way, which we all recognize, is faith, hope, and love. Faith in the sense that our Christian faith can be such a tremendous source of encouragement and comfort. Like I found this Bible verse, for example, brought me great comfort, knowing that actually I don't need to grieve the way people without hope grieve. I can grieve in a different way because I have this God who's with me. I know what joy it will be for my mom to finally come and be with her Lord and Savior. Faith in the sense of how we practice our faith, how we believe for the best. I want to quote the chief rabbi. He really blew me away with one thing. And I know he's right, because it's the kind of thing we think about as psychologists. I don't know if you remember, he said, I'd rather be an optimist and wrong than a pessimist and right. Sometimes when I have clients helping them with stress, etc., we often talk about there's sometimes we're so obsessed with what is right and wrong, but we should be thinking what is useful or not useful. Very gavnlig eller ikke gavnlig. And sometimes it might not be wrong to be sad and to embrace your pain and to drown in your grief. It's not wrong. Grief is grief. But is it useful to stay in that place of anger or bitterness or depression for a long, 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 long time? Will it create anything useful or constructive for you? In many ways, I don't think we're left with any other option than to have faith and to hope in a brighter future. Because it might not be wrong to be depressed and to give up, because life has dealt you some really hard knocks. I spoke with someone earlier today. This is one of the reasons why I love coming here, by the way. It gives me a wake-up call to the realities of life. I spoke to someone earlier today, and I'm not going to put any specific numbers because I haven't asked permission to share this, but let's just say he shared with me the length of time he's actually spent of his life in refugee camps. And it freaked me out a little bit. I'm thinking, whoa, we're talking about a significant percentage of your life as a human being on this planet has been in a refugee camp where others decide when you eat, when you sleep, when you do the other, And I think if that person thinks life is crap, who am I to deny and try and tell him otherwise? Life has dealt him some hard blows and some pretty bad cards. But what I would always say is, what kind of frame of mind is useful? Is it useful to get caught up in anger and bitterness and depression? Or could it be that because we have this Christian faith that we have, we can actually have hope? And like I say, I can't stand here and say and promise you a brighter future. I can't promise, I don't know if or when you will leave a refugee camp. I don't know if or when life will get better and all your, I don't. I cannot peddle cheap promises because the Bible doesn't. But what the Bible does promise us is that we have a hope on this side of heaven that Christ will walk with us. And we know, and this is one of the, I remember someone, I like to quote this, and I'm sure I've quoted it here before, but I remember someone telling me a story 20, 30 years ago. He said that there was like a court case, against Jesus, where they say, Jesus, and then this Jewish person comes up and say, yeah, my whole Jewish nation, we've been persecuted for years, hated by everyone, What do you know about that, I was born on, another one comes up, I was born under questionable circumstances, People put question mark about my mother, who was the real father, And people kept lying. You can see where it's going. People kept lining up with their cup. I was beaten and tortured. And I was totally innocent for stuff I didn't do. I was rejected by my own people. So they're all lining up, making all these accusations against Christ. And of course, then it clicks for them that Christ himself went through all these things. He went through all these things. So there's no suffering. There's no terror you've experienced. There's no difficulty. There's no hardship that in one way or the other Christ can relate to. And therefore, on this side of heaven, he promises us comfort. He promises us strength to walk this journey. And of course, on the other side of this life, there I can say with certainty, it's going to be good. There we can make big promises, Streets paved with gold, mansions, all this kind of stuff that we love to hear about. The promise is there for the other side. But on this side, God's great plan is faith, hope, and love. And when I come to love now, it's because I want to talk about the Christian community. That God has created a system for us to cope with the difficulties in life. And that is one another. If I remember rightly, people cleverer than me said there's over 100 one another's in the Bible. Love one another, help one another, be kind to one another, pray for one another. The one another's. So the love of the body of Christ is also God's answer to help us through grief. And I found, if I relate back to my grief from my mom, I found a new sense of respect for some of our traditions in Sierra Leone this year. Because truth is, I'm an introvert, so I get easily overwhelmed if it's like nonstop. But we have a tradition in Sierra Leone, literally from the day the person dies, every single day until the person is buried, you get visitors. And I'm not talking about one or two people. I'm talking about, on average, anything between 15 and 30 people. And sometimes they come as a whole group. There was one day there was like 25 people from the Creole Descendants Union, where my mom found her new mission to pray for the Creoles. They all came at once, and they hold these talks, and you know what? I remember with my dad, I was a little bit in shock, and I was irritated. I was like, no, more people, you know. But this time I was in a different frame of mind where I thought, wow, look at all these people coming to comfort me, coming to stand with me, coming to tell me stories about my mom, coming to remind me of my childhood. I was even more impressed, actually. My sister lives in Lagos, Nigeria. The Nigerians have taken this to a whole other level about supporting your friends. My sister had 5 friends and 1 employee travel all the way from Nigeria just to be with her at her time of grief and go to the funeral. All the Danes are thinking, what? It sounds out there, doesn't it? Shouldn't they just have permission to grieve in quiet and in privacy? This is what I was sharing earlier, that in Denmark we take independence to too extreme a level where we can actually end up leaving people lonely and unsupported. You know, for those of you who were there, you remember that. But God's answer to helping us through difficult times has and will always include people, the support of people. So the responsibility lies on both sides. One, for us to open our hearts to people, to receive them who want to meet us in our grief. But also for those who are not in grief at the time, to reach out to those who we know are struggling, who we know are finding life difficult, who we know are sometimes in the pits of depression. So, I'm doing very well for time for once. This is great. Beata will be happy. So I'm wrapping up soon. So ultimately, like I said, the answer, I believe, to dealing and finding and being able to embrace the past. You know, actually, one of the things I was reading in preparation for this is like, it's good to memorialize the past and the people from the past. So I'm not saying forget the past and forget the people. In fact, actually, you know, like it's going to be 5 years since my dad died, and we're talking about establishing some kind of plaque. We have a tradition in the Anglican church I grew up at that, you know, sometimes you put a little plaque in remembrance of the person, etc. Because it is important to remember those we've lost and the things we lost, etc. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not just saying move on, forget it all. But what I'm saying is, it's good to also think what's useful and what's not useful. And the mindset that's useful is to embrace hope, is to embrace faith, is to embrace the community of God, the people God who's put around us to support us, to help us through these difficult times. God himself will walk with us, both in our aloneness, but also in fellowship with those around us. So that's all I wanted to share with you this evening. That while it can be heavy and it can be difficult, we're not alone in it. God is with us, but he's also provided his community of believers to support us. And we all have a corporate responsibility to bring that support, to be that support, but also receive that support. Thank you for being patient with me with such a heavy topic.